I remember like not having my parents, had to raid my brother's bank account because we didn't have enough money, and they turned the heat on, barely at all in the wintertime, and I hated the cold. And there were 2 years where my parents didn't even have enough money to send us to school, and so my mother homeschooled us. Like they just didn't have money to send us to like a missionary school that didn't charge all that much. And so at the time, I hated it, resented it. I was embarrassed. How do I tell my friends that I can't go to school? But in retrospect, like, my mother taught us, and I learned that as long as I had curiosity and the desire, I could teach myself anything from a book. And so one of the big themes in Shooting Up is the constellations of learning, which is to say, not only does learning and reading make us sort of who we are as people, but also in a way also provides solace, for suffering, and answers, or even helps us think and appreciate life a bit more.
Thank you for entering the Gray Zone. I'm Robbie, your host, and as always, this will be the podcast where your theories are going to come to die, your theology will be tested, and as always, we remember on the other side of every issue is a person whom God loves. Today, a little change of pace. We've all heard of missionaries, and we've all heard of missionary kids, MKs, as some people like to call it. And today we're going to hear from an MK who's all grown up and has written a memoir about that time growing up as a missionary kid. The book is called Shooting Up, and it's by Johnathan Tepper, who is my guest today. I think you'll love this story because it is about a lot of universal things, although his story is extremely unique and really fascinating, and we're going to let him tell that story to you mostly. There are a lot of universals about truth, about sacrifice, about the risks of doing overseas missions and being a missionary in places that it's not always pleasant. It's hard work. So I think you'll enjoy this kind of different conversation as we just dive into his story and let him shine light on the things that God showed him growing up in a very unique situation. Please enjoy my conversation with Johnathan Tepper. Well, g'day. Welcome to the Gray Zone. Yet again, I'm Robbie, your host, and today I am joined by Johnathan Tepper. Welcome to the Gray Zone, Johnathan.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
Johnathan is here because he has a new book out. The title of your book, it's a memoir of love, loss, and addiction called Shooting Up. I love the title for many reasons. It's got a little boy with, a ball in his hands on the cover. Looks like, oh, this is a basketball memoir. And then you read addiction and you put a couple things together. You go, this is going to be an interesting read. Jonathan's here to talk about this. And we're going to explore a lot of the things in this book, particularly to your story, Johnathan. You grew up with a special badge of honor. You are an MK. What does MK mean in your circle?
Sure. So I think that, I've read quite a few books on MKs and then talked to others. And I think quite often people put MKs into one bucket. And I think, if you know one MK, you know one MK, which is to say that many have completely different life experiences. Like if you're growing up in Africa or India, they may have sent you off to boarding school half the time. If you grew up in Europe, you might have lived with your parents. And so I think MKs have very different experiences. Mine specifically and my brother's. My parents moved to Spain in 1983 and started a drug rehab center in 1985. And so my brothers and I basically grew up alongside my parents. And the book starts, the first chapter is us handing out flyers to heroin addicts, sort of as they were shooting up or sitting around smoking and drinking with their friends. And that really was our childhood, which is, to say that we were in a very, very poor neighborhood in Madrid, trying to help people. And so it's certainly a very unusual background. And when you're a kid, and as an MK, you might think it's sort of totally normal because that's the only normal that you know. And it's not really until sort of getting off to college where you start meeting other people and realize actually that you have a very abnormal childhood in many ways. And that was sort of my experience.
And so if you haven't picked up, MK is a missionary kid, and there are millions of them all over the world. And I think Jonathan's right to say they're all, there's definitely in the Venn diagram of their experience, there's a lot in common in the center, but everyone also is going to come out of that a little bit differently. Two of my very dearest friends, some of my best friends are MKs, and they both have mixed feelings about that experience, and I think that mixed experience, does it show up just when you're met with the contrast with the kid who has a quote unquote normal life? Or are you looking over your shoulder by the time you're 10, 12 and going, this can't be totally normal? Like, what was your experience kind of going, I didn't necessarily have the cookie cutter childhood?
So, I mean, it's interesting. I think obviously as you get older in life in general, you become more self-aware and more aware of sort of how your life is like others or different. And it's interesting that one of the terms they use for missionary kids, MKs, is also TCKs, which is third culture kids. And part of that
Mm.
definition essentially comes from the idea that you're not really part of one or the other. So in my case, American parents growing up in Spain. So you grow up thinking you're, proudly American, yet your entire sort of culture growing up is speaking Spanish and being around other people and eating Spanish food. And you get back to the US and everything feels a bit foreign when you're visiting your relatives. And then when you're in Spain, particularly like my brothers and I, blonde haired, blue eyed, you're very definitely not Spanish, but you can speak Spanish fluently and you're, involved with the church and the drug rehab. And so this third culture comes from effectively being between the two or a mix of the two. And I think that that sort of persists throughout your entire life, where I've found that a lot of my very best friends in college and afterwards subconsciously ended up being other people who were also third culture kids, not specifically missionary kids, but people who themselves, had like a mother from one place, a father from another, or a family of one country that then grew up somewhere else. And so what you find is that, it's almost like you feel they can understand you and you can understand them. And, obviously I wish I could understand, people who grew up in one culture better. And I think that, and it comes out a little bit in the book where I didn't look down on the students around me at Chapel Hill necessarily, but I didn't feel that I understood them or they understood me. And so in some ways it affects you adversely and badly. And in other ways, it's very positive where you grow up, with many different cultural influences.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I love that. And so a lot of it, I guess you're circling around identity is a big part of it, right? As we grow up, we learn who we are by the elders in our life. The culture around us informs us of who we are, and then we wrestle with it the rest of our lives, I guess, trying to be okay with it, even if it's the perfect circumstances.
Well, and
So
for some missionary kids, for example, and every missionary kid obviously is different. I know, people who've had different experiences where sometimes at the age of 18, or even your parents decided they're going to no longer be missionaries after doing it for a decade, go back to the US, and then there's suddenly this part of your life that's no longer there, where you grew up in France and are back in the US or, South Africa or wherever it might be, India. And then in other cases, like the parents move back and the kids feel that they like really don't want to leave the city they grew up in, and so then they're basically permanent expats. And I know both cases.
yeah, I hadn't even thought of that, but of course that happens. Absolutely. That's fascinating. So let's paint the big picture here. Tell us about these missionaries who are your parents, and what was their sort of crazy dream that led to this life that you talk about in the book.
Yeah, so the book starts out where I give a little bit of background, but it was certainly a very unusual family. And my father, he grew up in a Jewish family in Long Island, so not exactly like your normal Christian missionary background. And he studied economics at Cambridge, and then got his MBA at Harvard, and thought he was going to go down sort of that path. And then he had a religious experience at Harvard, where he said that he had a vision of heaven and hell. And, it sounded really weird to me as a kid listening to it at the dinner table. It still sounds a bit weird, but, people have very powerful religious experiences. And that led him to convert. And then he met my mother at a Bible study in North Carolina, and they both wanted to become missionaries. And so my parents lived in Mexico for about 5 years before they went to Spain. And my father worked with university students. He was teaching money and banking at the university, but also being a chaplain on the side. And then they decided to move to Spain. They felt that God had called them there. And it was very interesting once you want to do exactly the same thing, just go work with university students. And missionaries are poor in general, even in third world countries or poorer countries. It's not like missionaries are earning that much and living like kings. And so my parents settled in San Blas, which was one of the poorest neighborhoods in Madrid, because rent was cheap. And it was right next to a very large gypsy camp and a huge open air drug supermarket. So my father kept on visiting the universities, trying to, start a church among students, and with zero success. And then they just started trying to help the heroin addicts in the neighborhood. So they ended up going out to the streets and had little flyers, invite them back to our house for a Friday night, and just to see how they could help. And then we're sending them out to drug rehabs in other parts of Spain. And the need was so great, and the neighborhood was basically the largest dealing point for heroin, not only in Spain but in Europe at the time. That with an Australian missionary, Lindsay McKinsey, and then another Mike, they both ended up marrying Mike Hall. they started this meeting of essentially the church in our living room, and it was just like this sort of, as Lindsay called it, Grand Central for heroin addicts and junkies coming in trying to get help. And one of them then moved in with Lindsay, who lived down the hill, and then he invited 8 of his friends in, and that was so that you had the start of a drug rehab with 8 junkies living together, getting off heroin with Lindsay. And then that was 1985. Today, 2025, you have, or 2026, but 40 years later, you have, over 2,000 people living in Battelle and the residences, and it's all run by the former addicts. And so the memoir is of a 7-year-old boy basically watching all this happen. And it's the profound friendship and love between myself and Raul, the first addict. And then, one of the things that comes out pretty quickly in the story is my parents. I remember 1985, we'd been out playing soccer. We came in late. What do you do in the summertime? You're having so much fun. You don't listen to your parents. And getting home, and my parents telling us that, calling us into the living room, and I thought we were going to be punished. And they told us about AIDS and about the HIV virus. And all the addicts shared needles back then. So you'd see them, often they didn't have enough needles, they'd share. So as it turned out, almost all the early addicts in the program became HIV positive. And then, the story really is the sort of shooting up love, loss, and addiction is really about that love for the early addicts who became like older brothers and sisters, and then the eventual loss.
How old were you at that moment when you got called into the living room?
I think I was probably 9, maybe. I'm pretty sure it was around. It could have been 8, but I'm pretty sure it was 9.
So acquainted with not just death, not just addiction, but also the AIDS epidemic, which was, COVID is the only thing I can think that compares. And COVID obviously went a lot further, but AIDS in particular targeted that's the wrong language, but it hit very specific populations.
Yes.
People using needles and obviously the homosexual community abroad. So you're 9 and you're kind of right in the middle of that. How does that shape who you become when you're 10 and 12 and 15?
Well, so the strange thing was that I think like at first, you become aware of it, and it didn't really mean very much because the incubation period's about 5 years. And so some of the early addicts found out that they were HIV positive, but they didn't start dying immediately. It wasn't, I think the first death was like the next year. And one of the photographs in the back of the book is of me and handing out flyers to my dad. And I couldn't believe it. We printed it up and got it translated into Spanish so some of the addicts in the program could read the story. And one of them recognized that it was their brother, Luis Mendoza, who had died. And I didn't realize he was the first addict who died of AIDS. And so there we are, like handing him the flyer. And so it was Luis's death really that made me aware that, actually, this is a matter of life and death. And then as the years went on, the number of deaths just started skyrocketing. And so it was really as the deaths started going up very much, it was more when I was sort of 13, 14, 15, that's when, you had quite a lot of them dying. And the peak of deaths in Spain was 1994. And that was when I went off to college when I was 18. And so it really meant that I was very young, and like people are going off to prom or going off to college. Part of the book is I was going off with my family to hospitals, weekends, evenings, visits with my mother and father, and that really was my teenage and high school years.
So did your parents or the characters in the story, as you tell it, receive a lot of criticism for putting their family at the center, something like that?
It's very interesting that you ask that, because that's one of the most common and frequent reactions that I get from readers when they're reading it. It's like, how could your father, and specifically my father, who's sort of a slightly more driving force in life and in the book. My mother often, she was like the sort of the voice of reason and then along for the ride, moderating them a bit. And my father asked me also whether he likes the depiction in the book. He thinks I was a little hard on him, but he thinks I told the story as it was. Indeed, some of the early reactions from the readers is that they're angry at my father. Like, how could he involve his kids in this work, and how could he expose them to, sort of a dark or dangerous side of life, and then, heroin addiction and AIDS. But by the end of the story, the same people are telling me that they come away with a great sense of admiration for my parents and for the work they did. And I think the fact that they can have both ideas in their mind at the same time, I think tells me that I've done a reasonably good job of presenting them as complex human people. And obviously, I think like my brothers and I turned out well, in the sense that, we're sort of happy and I think well adjusted, and we all ended up going off and getting good educations. Had that not been the case, then maybe there'd be a lot more to be resentful about, but I
Mhm.
don't feel that's the case.
How involved were you in this ministry and in this home? I mean, were you?
Like I would say 100% in the sense that, like, obviously you have schooling to go to, and then you do play. We used to play soccer, football in the streets, and things like that. But like to the extent that I got the family and the centers sorry, the family's mission in the center took over all of our lives. A lot of like traveling out to visit drug rehab centers. Obviously, they'd have a Friday night service, which started from the Friday night meetings in the home, and they had the Sunday morning service. And I used to spend the summers living out with the men on the farm, working in the. I worked like one of the painting teams. My brother Peter worked with the mechanics, and the center ran businesses to pay for itself, and we'd work in the secondhand furniture stores. So like a lot of our childhood was working side by side with dear men and women who were recovering addicts, and that really was our life. So and they were all, we were in our teens, and they were 10, 15 years older than us. So it was a very sort of unusual life.
Did you before we talk about, I guess, the good things you took away from that and learned? I wonder. I mean, did you ever feel resentment? Did you ever feel like this is too much? You ever feel like I'd love to just be dating girls and playing
Yeah.
soccer, mom? Like what is that like?
Yeah, no, so it's very interesting. Like I remember very vividly, it was, I was 11 at the time. And in 1987, you had a stock market crash in the US, and the dollar had become very weak between 85 and 87. And you can tell that my father studied economics and got his MBA because like he would draw diagrams on the back of a napkin and try to explain to me why like our income had gone down by 50%, in about 18 months. And when you're a missionary kid, you're a missionary in general, you live at the whim of exchange rates, right? When the dollar's strong, you live like a king, and when it's weak, you suffer. And so, I remember like not having my parents, had to raid my brother's bank account because we didn't have enough money, and they turned the heat on, barely at all in the wintertime, and I hated the cold. And there were 2 years where my parents didn't even have enough money to send us to school, and so my mother homeschooled us. There wasn't like some ideological thing where they wanted to homeschool us. It was more like they just didn't have money to send us to like a missionary school that didn't charge all that much. And so at the time I hated it, resented it. I was embarrassed. How do I tell my friends that I can't go to school? But in retrospect, like, my mother taught us, and I learned that as long as I had curiosity and the desire, I could teach myself anything from a book. And so one of the big themes in Shooting Up is the constellations of learning, which is to say, not only does learning and reading make us sort of who we are as people, but also in a way also provides solace, for suffering, and answers, or even helps us think and appreciate life a bit more.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, because I mean, you you're telling this story because it's unique. You're telling this story because it's not typical, although it might have a lot to do and to relate with other MKs. But I think a lot of people, especially locked in like, our comfortable Western lifestyle, have a pretty simple stereotype of this is what a good childhood looks like. This is what a good high school experience looks like. These are the trajectories that I want to intervene on early enough so that, kid A gets to university A and is on that life path. And so I hear you speaking in terms of like, there was this hope, and this is like, yeah, none of this really was exactly how, no one would set their, except my parents would set me on this path to be successful. And obviously later in your story, we'll talk about, your success and your ability to do really well. But I guess what I'm liking is there is that set path, and you're like, I didn't live that. I learned differently. I lived differently. I served differently. And all of it still benefited me in some way and led me towards, a trajectory that maybe people wouldn't guess.
Yeah, so I think that well, like, first, at a very high level, I think books are only really useful and relevant in the sense that they touch on something that's deep and universal. And so if I simply wrote a story of a very odd, unique childhood, then it's certainly interesting to read, but it wouldn't have any relation to the reader. What I've tried to do is to write a book that touches on love and loss, which we all experience, no matter what walk of life. We're all eventually touched by death of those around us. And I hope that universal element is the one that really touches readers' hearts, and that people respond respond to. I think that to your point, um, clearly, there are people who grow up in much more difficult circumstances, and in some of my own life, I had some difficult circumstances. But I think that, much like the parable of the talents in the Bible, the question isn't sort of do you have a lot or do you have a little, but what do you do with what you have? And I could have easily done very little, being homeschooled and decided that, there wasn't any education to be had. Or I could think, what, like, if this is what it's going to be, like, let's figure out how we learn here. And later in the book, I used to go visit the addicts in Ramon y Cajal, which is the largest hospital in Madrid, and it had the infectious diseases ward on the 8th floor, which is where all the people with HIV and hepatitis were. And at the entrance it was one day when I was going down, and because you don't see it coming in, you see it going out. There was a quote from Ramon y Cajal, and they named the hospital after the first Spaniard who won a Nobel Prize for his work in medicine, where he examined neurons under a microscope. And he said, every man can become the sculptor of his own mind if he sets himself the task. And I saw this beautiful quote in gold letters on a white lintel, and I just thought, this has to be true. Like, I'm going to become the sculptor of my own mind. And it made me think of the parable of the talents, which is like, we can decide what we're going to do with the tools that we have. And, one of those things, obviously, with books and reading is really becoming the sculptor of our own minds. And that was one of the great inspirations of my childhood.
I really like that. It's making me think of what you said about your father and your mother and how they came with one intent to this place to do work and to serve others, and kind of hit a wall, but then they stumbled upon people in need, and they said, well, okay, we'll take what we have here and we're going to do something to serve these desperate people instead. It wasn't really even what they intended to do. And maybe some of that weaves into your story as well.
Very much. Yeah, I think that quite often you think that there's one thing that's is like your key to happiness, and that's some prefigured plan, and actually it's quite often something totally different that ends up marking your life, not for the better.
You're so right. You're so right. I heard someone say that walking is a series of falling and imbalance, and that's actually how we walk, is we intentionally put our body into imbalance and we catch ourselves over and over. And yeah, life acts a little bit like that. In your story, is there a particular story or anecdote from it that has to do with grief and loss that you think was really relevant? I mean, you're working alongside and knowing these people face to face, and you're knowing them not as addicts, as humans, as people who are in need. And I imagine there were some people that you had to say goodbye to that may have been hard.
Yeah, so the central story of the book is my relationship to Raul, who's the first addict in the program. He became an older brother to my brothers and me. He entered the center in 1985 when it started, and then he died in September of 1995, so 10 years later. And I was in college when he died. It's interesting when you write a memoir, and I had to make a note about it in the beginning of the book, because you have conversations there and no one has a photographic memory. What you're trying to do is to essentially capture the spirit in an honest way of the conversations, rather than verbatim. But there are certain things that you hear in life that you can never forget. And I remember Trini was one of the addicts. She and her husband Tomas were running Batel in Valencia. She was dying in Ramon y Cajal, and this was in June of 1994, right as I was about to head off to college. And Raul at that time was quite sick and had lost a lot of weight. And I went out to the hallway and I was just crying, 'cause, it was just a very sad scene watching her die, and a lot of the leaders were there. And Raul came out and told me that he was not afraid for himself to die. He knew he was going to die, but the thing that he was most concerned about was his wife and his daughters. And he asked me to look after his daughters, cuida de mis hijas. And that's something that you never forget. And I have that in the book. And one of the principles of great writing is show, don't tell. And I think that little episode shows the profound love a father had, where he was not thinking of himself and near the moment of his death, but rather thinking of his beautiful daughters. And I didn't even realize it. They're like nieces. They're now grown women, but they were like nieces to me at the time. And they didn't really have many memories of their father. And so one of the most beautiful things of the book, whether someone buys a copy or not of this book, is that they actually feel that they get to know their father a lot more by reading through these stories because, he died when they were so young.
What a beautiful gift. Your story reminds me of one I experienced recently with a patient passing, and it was, he's kind of the patriarch of the family. We're here in New Mexico, so we have a lot of Spanish tradition as well, and in my family. Anyways, beside the point. And he, up to the very end, he just didn't want painkillers. He didn't want anything that would dull his senses. And as healthcare and the philosophy of hospice is like, we don't want you to be tough soldier. We want you to be comfortable. We want you resting. And I finally was able to sit with him in private and basically talk to him about it. And his heart was, I want to be as present here for as long as I can, as like kind of my last act of sacrifice for my family. And we had to step back as a group and kind of, let everyone on our team be okay with that, because it goes against what we think we're trying to do, is serve them. And he's like, this is my last act of service to them, is to, may I suffer, but be with them fully and as much as I can. And that was his last act of love. And sometimes I think that's really powerful. So a lot of us hear about how we should love people. A lot of us hear about how we should have compassion. How did growing up this way change the way that you understand grace, compassion, and service, seeing it lived out, daily?
I mean, I think you just sort of defined it yourself, which is that you have to live it out. And I think that, it's one thing to say that you love other people. It's one thing to say that you have compassion. But ultimately, the question is, what are you doing about it? And, I think that, what I've tried to do throughout my life is I've been, when I was very involved in the drug rehab centers in the summertime, when I went off to college at Chapel Hill, I was, involved with the homeless shelter. I was involved with translating for migrant workers, because a lot of them would go to the community clinics and the hospitals, and the doctors didn't speak Spanish, and then the poor workers didn't speak much English, and I was like trying to translate for them and things like that. And it's like, just I've sat in the been board of directors of Battelle of Britain, and try to donate as much as I can to organizations to help people. And I think ultimately it really is about acts of service. And clearly you don't have to quit your job and go off and volunteer somewhere, but there are ways that everyone can be involved, whether it's monetarily or whether it's through helping supervise charities or whatever it might be. There are people that you day to day can live out, and through acts of service, your love and compassion.
Yeah, I think we can. I think you said it right. You don't have to just go overseas. I mean, you can throw a stone and hit someone who needs love and compassion, and wherever you live.
Absolutely. That's the
Probably
thing,
because you threw a stone at them. But jokes aside, it's just look up, and see the people in front of you. It's ready.
Yeah, that's one thing that I found very interesting. I was doing research on sort of books similar to mine, in the sense of like heroin, AIDS in my neighborhood in Madrid. And I was reading reviews online of a book about heroin in my neighborhood, and they're like, the neighborhood was very nice. I don't think there was much need at all. And I was thinking, like, what neighborhood did you grow up in? It's like, and I realized that some people actually genuinely do go through life with blinkers, where they don't see what's around them. And I think no matter what town or city you're in, it's very easy to go through and not see pain or suffering or need around you. But if you have your eyes open to it, or make an effort to see it, like, it's there. And there's plenty of places that people can volunteer and be active in their own community.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, you say Madrid, and I think romance and bullfighting and, hot summers and, but any point on the map in this world has people who are hurting and dealing with addiction or anything else. The geography doesn't really affect that, unfortunately, as much as we like to pretend it does. So as Christians, people, this is a topic that's come up before for me on my podcast a lot, is God and suffering. And you grew up straight up in it and around it, and somehow maintained your faith. Was that hard sometimes? I mean, to see so much pain and suffering and addiction, seeing people maybe never get past it, and reconciling that with, a God who we're told is loving, a God who told heals, a God who we're told can help people break addictions.
So first of all, I'm not a pastor or theologian, and I don't pretend to tell anyone the way to live their own lives or what kind of conclusions or beliefs they should have. What I've tried to do with the book is really to tell a story as honestly as possible, and and I hope as a writer as beautifully as possible in the sense that you want to engage the reader. But one of the key themes of the book is what you just identified, which is this theme of how do you make sense of suffering and how do you find meaning through it. One of the things that I write in the epilogue, and quite a few readers have told me it's like one of their favorite paragraphs in the book, and I never really thought that would be a paragraph people would find the most memorable, is I say that I think suffering itself is meaningless. It's our response to it that gives it meaning. And you can essentially choose to become bitter, or you can can soften your heart and you can become more loving. And one of the things I remember where there's a character early on in the book, Manolo Majara, who is and Majara in Spanish, slang means crazy. He was his father used to abuse him, and he used to like squeeze my hand and bully and abuse me a bit. And I was afraid to be around him. And then I remember going to the hospital and seeing him, and he was very weak. And I was 16, 17 at that time and much bigger than he was. And I remember squeezing his hand and, or telling him that I was going to squeeze his hand and cause pain to him that he caused me. And as we were leaving the hospital, my mother told me, she said, don't harden your heart. The answer to suffering is always more love. And so to your question, one of the things in that paragraph, I said, the answer to suffering, at least for me, is always more love, which is to say that when people are hurting, our response should be more love. And I can't say that I have the answer to suffering or anything like that, but I found that certainly for me, if the story of the gospel or the Sermon on the Mount is about love, then I think that is the answer to pain and suffering.
That's beautifully put. I love that. Just keeping our hearts tender, and that can be a full-time job.
It's very hard. It's not easy.
I don't know anyone who's mastered it yet, but
yeah.
So on that note, like let's jump forward a little bit. You've been successful. You you get educated, you become a Rhodes Scholar, all this great stuff. You've worked in finance. How did you see, like, let's be honest, I don't think I'm going to hurt your feelings. When I think finance, I don't think compassion. I don't think, finance and loving, compassionate, sacrificial people. Now, that's a stereotype, obviously, broad strokes, but it's not something that I put together in my head. How did you find, I guess, your upbringing and the life that you led influenced that sort of space, that career that you've made?
So, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't really want to go into finance when I was younger, actually. Like a lot of the things that I was very passionate about were history, foreign policy. And so I thought I might end up working like for the State Department or something, or politics, and try to do some good from a public policy standpoint. And then I realized, one, like I'm a third culture kid and a missionary kid. Like, who am I trying to fool? Like, if I were like to go settle in some town in America and tell them I'm going to represent them, it's like I'm not, I don't have roots anywhere. And also, I just thought it's not really something. And given my personality, I also realized, like, getting involved with politics a little bit more, there's an enormous amount of retail side to politics that's, some people are really suited to it and others are not, and I'm definitely not. And so then I started thinking, like, well, what do I really, really enjoy? And like, I grew up thinking about economics and finance from my father and his lectures at the dinner table and things like that, or like drawing on napkins. My father used to explain diminishing marginal utility to me, and like I still have the bad habit with my wife of like drawing on napkins, and I did that on our first date. But I just realized, like, I actually really do enjoy thinking about economics, and then obviously investing is a particular side of that, which is like on a microeconomic level. And so that's what I do. And to your point that obviously investing could be driven by greed, and I think a lot of it is, where you're out to, like, to get a high level of returns for yourself. I think they're also, it really is, what you make of it, in the sense that, what are your motivations? And I know some extremely wealthy people who live far below their means and donate quite a lot of it, and it really doesn't change them at all. Were wonderful people without that much money when they started their career, and they end up being sort of wonderful people with quite a lot of money towards the end of it, and have done a lot of anonymous good. And then there are other people who, I think were probably, not at all nice people when they started out, and they become very rich, greedy people with quite a lot of money. And so I think you have to find a way to be true to your values and not change and use money for good.
What would you say is the chief value that you took from your parents and from their example and from the life that you grew up in?
Um, it's a good question. I think probably sort of sacrificial love in the sense that they really. My father's 79. He turned 80 in August of this year, and he had a stroke last August and recovered very well. But he wants to work until he dies, and I think my mother, she died a couple years ago, but she would have done the same. And for them, there isn't any one grand heroic act in their lives. It's like every day is a series of small, loving acts. And I have a quote from Arthur Ashe at the end of the book, and he died of AIDS in 1993. He was a great tennis player, and he said that true heroism is not putting yourself above others, at all cost. He said it's putting others ahead and at whatever cost. And I think that's really sort of heroism and sort of a life of service.
That's really beautiful. Yeah, the long life of service sometimes, yeah, means so much more than, hey, we built a hospital with our name on it. Didn't do much else, but we did that. Nothing wrong with that. But I track with what you're saying. I was recently at a memorial for a grandfather of a dear friend, and it was just one of those men who just lived quietly, serving and loving people their whole lives. And McDonald's Bible studies, that he ran for 40 years, that kind of guy. And the room was filled, and this is an older man in a small town. It shouldn't be that many people there. And I
Yeah,
remember one of his grandsons said, the best thing we learned from him is not how to be a great man, but just how to be a good man.
yeah.
And I walked away going, yeah, that's a better goal. That's a good goal.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I mean, it's interesting. My mother died in 2012, and like I couldn't believe it. 1,500 people came to the church, and which like Spanish
Wow.
churches tend to be pretty small. And then they
Yeah.
were broadcasting on the internet. There were like over 1,000 IP addresses watching, strangers coming up to me telling that she changed their life. And you realize that, she was this very sort of unassuming woman who worked with my father, and you realize how many lives she touched over that period. And it was just sort of showing up every day and giving love to people, and none of that is beyond any of us.
I agree. Yeah. Well said. The consistency of just a life lived loving and serving people. That's beautiful. So, what was the next thing I was going to say? You touched a little bit on like the political world. How, I mean, I don't have to point anything out. It's a crazy time we're living in. It's very divisive. Um, how do we live in this world with compassion when it feels like maybe it's a drop in the bucket, or it's not seen, or maybe it's not going to do anything? We have all this kind of self-interest and identity politics, and everyone who thinks differently than me is an enemy. I mean, I don't know. I'm asking you to solve the world, but I mean, what do you see that gives you hope, or what are things that you think actually do make a difference or change things?
Well, I think that most of us don't have the ability to change public policy, but what we certainly do have the ability is to sort of change the world around us and to influence the people around us. And I think that unfortunately, the American church, in part, has, I think, become very interested in politics and culture wars, and the perception that if you have the right political, stand, or if you take the right view on, certain issues of morality or whatever it might be in public life, that you've done a good job as a Christian. And actually, I think that if you look through the Bible and you look at Sermon on the Mount, like Jesus wasn't asking anyone's politics or asking anyone to do anything differently, as a prerequisite to loving them and being there for him. And like, who did he spend his time with? It was like the Samaritans. He started spending his time with prostitutes and tax collectors and Romans. And I think if you read the New Testament very carefully, you see that like we're not called to love people who are exactly like us. We're called to love people, who are at the margins, who are like heroin addicts and people who are HIV positive. And, and that was the issue that my book's about. But today, they're different groups. And I would say that, there's also quite a lot of demonization that goes on, which is, I think one thing, you think another. I'm a better person than you are. You clearly are an idiot, or or you're subhuman or whatever it might be, these attitudes that creep in on both sides. I think there's really shouldn't be any place for that in sort of a faith that's, rooted in compassion and love.
Argue with you at all? Absolutely. Yeah, that's really well said. It's kind of going back to what you said earlier. It's really about like, is your compassion shown through acts? Like, do you act according to the things you believe, or is it just I have the right beliefs, therefore I'm good? I think that's a big issue on the full gamut of the political spectrum. Wherever you swing on that, it's okay. Show me by your acts, like it says in the book of James. Show me your faith by what you're actually doing about it. Yeah. This is a totally changing topic as we kind of are slowing in, kind of coming into home base. A writer question. You chose to write a memoir, not an autobiography. Why?
So the answer is very, very simple. One, specifically, I was working at SAC Capital in New York, and I was living on the Upper West Side. And one weekend, I walked into a bookstore around the corner from me. I think it was a Barnes and Noble, and I saw this beautiful cover, and it said "Flying Over 96th Street: Memoir of an East Harlem White Boy." And I thought, great photo, great title. I've got to pick it up. So I picked it up, and it was about a blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy whose parents moved to East Harlem in the 50s and 60s and ran a church with primarily Puerto Ricans and Black people, really trying to help the poor, offering education. And it was just this beautiful, beautiful story that made the neighborhood and the friends come to life. And it was elegiac. And I just thought, like, no one's really done this for my neighborhood. And this guy's lived a life like mine, where your parents take you and transplant you somewhere else. And so that was the impetus to start writing it. And so then I thought, I need to write this. So I started writing. And this was 05 to 08. I'd finished the first draft. And I didn't really know how to write because I've written, a dissertation at Oxford and so on. And a lot of that, like economics and history, is very different. You're it is an autobiography, effectively. And you're telling the reader what they need to know. A memoir, while it's true, is actually much more novelistic, right? What you're doing, you're telling a story. And it's not the whole story because the reader is bored it's like, no, I'm not famous. No one needs to know every last detail about my life or the history of drugs in Madrid. With a memoir, what it really is a 3-act story, the beginning, a middle, and an end, and certain narrative arcs and certain characters. And that is totally different than like writing an autobiography. And autobiographies, I think, are worth reading if someone's famous. But a memoir is something that really connects with the reader, where even if you don't know or care about this person, it's written sort of so beautifully or in such an engaging way and telling a particular narrative arc that you really want to read. And so that's why I had to write a memoir rather than autobiography.
Yeah, I like that. I love that. It's to me, it sounds like you're saying, like, what you're doing is you're conveying truth more than facts. Even though the facts are in there, it's like it's more important that you get who my dad was rather than let me tell you exactly what he did and said on these dates. I'm trying to put him in a character that you can feel and imagine a little better.
Absolutely. Like the key lesson for writing is essentially show, don't tell. And that's why great movies do that. Bad ones tell you, they don't show you. And with a memoir, what you really are trying to do is to sort of get the reader into the story and sort of show them what's happening. And ultimately, and there are two reasons I think why it works. One is it's a lot more interesting anyway. And two, it actually makes the reader a participant in the story where you're trying to figure things out as you go along. And then there's a payoff when you figure it out and things happen. Whereas if you're simply told what things about, it's totally passive. The writer's sitting there telling you what's going on and you're not really actively involved.
Yeah, you approach that type of work differently, right? You approached it like, I need to gather and absorb information, and there might be a test at the end of the chapter, whereas it's much more fun to be swept into the story and kind of run away with it. I agree. Maybe you should write a musical too, Johnathan, shooting up the musical and just...
Yeah, I think someone was like, are you going to write another memoir? And I'm like, there is not another memoir.
Yeah. The second half, right?
Yeah.
No, that's great. Well, where can we point people if they want to go and check out the book? Where's the best place to send them?
Sure. So obviously everyone has different preferences where they buy books. You can do it on Amazon. You can do it at your local bookstore. I love bookstores, so I do support your local bookstore. But you can, and then the U.S. publisher Infinite you can actually order it directly from them too if you want. And then Google, ChatGPT, and all these guys just search for "Shooting Up" Johnathan Tepper, and I guarantee you'll find dozens of links to buy it. But I really hope it's a story that touches people's hearts and that ideally leads to more love and empathy.
That's always a good reason to write a book is a good goal that just that loves people, that helps people. Well, Johnathan, thank you so much for spending time, for putting this book into the world, a book that clearly is filled with things that are going to connect with people, help them maybe see themselves in it and find some redemption, find some hope, or just realize they're not the only one who has lived this sort of strange but really beautiful life. So we appreciate it, and we'll link to the book, obviously, so you guys can go find it wherever you'd like. And thank you for your time, Johnathan.
Well, Robbie, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Awesome, absolutely.